Welcome back. It is time for another reaction video. I'm going to be checking out the Second Opium Wars by History Matters. Again, because since I'm going to be releasing a video on the Opium Wars, I think it's fun to go through some of these together. And of course, before we get into the video, make sure to leave a like on the original video, subscribe to them. History Matters makes great, really short form content, just a couple minutes long. It allows you to get an idea of what's going on, of course, in history. In principle, you need many hours to really understand a topic, but at least this gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on. So this starts off here at the Second Opium War, right? So there's two of them, and honestly, I mean, calling them, of course, they are wars, but they are very one-sided. It's basically, so in the First Opium War, it's basically the UK beating China, and then in the Second Opium War, we're going to have a lot of more countries join in. You're going to have France actually joining with military, and both the US and Russia providing support. So China really doesn't stand any chance at all. It's really China just getting blown up, except in one instance at the Dagu forts, because the Europeans got a bit overconfident. But other than that, there's not really much they can do. So after the First Opium War, you have a period where some things change a little bit, right? You have the change of the emperor from Dao Guang to Xianfang, and something very important is that some of the treaties that those unequal treaties, as they are called, that China signed with some of the European powers, like well, not only European, I guess. I mean here the US, which is not European, and Russia. And those two treaties were up for revision 12 years after they were signed. But there was a bit of a problem because the one that China signed with the British was not up for revision. It had no revision clause. However, the British were granted most favored nation status. What that meant was that if China basically gave a cookie to any country, they were forced to also give that cookie to the British. So the British argued that if the Chinese were going to revise the treaties of the Americans and the Russians, then they should revise the treaty for the British as well. And that is something that the new Emperor Xianfang did not like one bit. So it's not really what sparks the war, but there's a lot of tension still going on from before the war. But let's get into this and let History Matters explain.
1856, and Britain is unhappy with China. The reason for this was that China, having recently been defeated in the previous Opium War, was supposed to give concessions to Britain, which it had yet to do. Another issue was that British consumption of...
Yes, they were not really interested in implementing many of the terms that the British had basically gotten from the war.
Was so great that Britain was operating a huge trade deficit with China. The only thing salvaging British finances was the continued sale of opium into China from British India. Another problem was that China was currently dealing with the Taiping rebellion, whose leaders kept destroying opium wherever they found it.
The Taiping rebellion, I get into that a little bit in my video, but it's super interesting. So the man shown here is Hong Qiuchuan, and this guy... he failed the public the exam to become a public officer for 3 times in a row and had a mental breakdown. And now I don't know when exactly it happened, but he basically had like this belief of, you know, being the brother of Jesus Christ. So he started a movement, and there were many people who were extremely unhappy, especially around the area of Canton, because since now China had opened up more ports to trade with the Europeans, Canton did not really have its monopoly anymore. So there were a lot of jobs that, you know, disappeared, which meant a lot of people were now unemployed and extremely angry. And also, you know, there was the matter of people just being very angry at the Chinese government. They lost faith in the Qing because they saw over and over again that they were just unable to solve any of their problems, and that would actually come to a boiling point. I think it was called like San Yuan Li. I may have gotten that wrong, but I think that's what it's called, where they actually, like, just Chinese people attacked British, even though they didn't really deal that much damage. But it still one of the first signs of, that drive to change. But anyways, back to the Taiping rebellion. It's very interesting because Hong Xiuquan got a lot of support and they actually got a massive territory. I think at their peak, they had like 500,000 soldiers and almost half of them, I think a couple, at least 100,000 of them were women. So he declared the complete equality between men and women, abolished a lot of the other religious ideas that were in China. So he was more like Christian-ish, right? I say ish because Christians wouldn't really believe that he's the brother of Christ, but his ideas were kind of closed. But yeah, it's really, really interesting. So I just continue. I'm only 26 seconds in, so let's go.
The sale of opium into China was vital for balancing Britain's finances, and so it had to keep flowing. In late 1856, the governor of Canton, Yi Ming-chen, impounded a Chinese-operated ship that he believed was committing piracy, or at least was working on behalf of the
Arrow,
rebels.
it's called.
One problem, though, the ship was registered in Hong Kong, now a British territory, and as a result, the British were furious. Frankly, the British consul to China, Harry Parkes, was itching for another war there because he wanted to make a name for himself. Yi offered to give the sailors back, but Britain said no and sailed the Royal Navy up the Pearl River and shelled Canton. Back in Britain, Parliament was...
Yeah, so there were a lot of things that were going on there. And one of the issues was that that ship called the Arrow, this is often called the Arrow Incident. Yes, it was a British ship, but the sailors itself were Chinese. And the British were arguing that basically because the ship, was around Hong Kong and it was British ship, that it's supposed to be British soil, and therefore the British should be the ones who had authority over it, that the Chinese had no right to go in there and seize those soldiers. So it's quite an interesting situation. But yeah, it's definitely one of the things that sparked the actual conflict then when the British ended up bombing Canton.
Was fiercely against any war with China, but the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was very much for it. Parliament voted against any further action, mostly because of the outbreak of a major mutiny in India in 1857. As a result, Palmerston called an election, and after denouncing the Chinese as barbarians to the British people, he won, and so war it was. An alliance was built with the French because they also wanted to trade with China, but the Americans, after taking a fort in late 1856, declared their neutrality, and Russia wanted nothing to do with it because they were still recovering from the Crimean War.
Yes, but they still participated in the sense that they gave their support in various ways.
So the war in China, the Second Opium War, followed a similar path to the first. The Royal Navy used their ironclad steam-powered warships to obliterate the Chinese wooden ships called junks wherever they met. In late 1857, Anglo-French forces captured Canton and captured Yi, who was then imprisoned in India. After this, the British and French navies made their way up the...
And that's, I believe, the point where this San Yuan Li event happened, where the Chinese ended up kind of rising against the British. They just attacked, dealt, quite a bit of damage, but it was more of a symbolic event. It would be referred to in years to come, and people would see that as a bit of a mythic event, right? The moment where the Chinese started to take make a stand, and when they just lost trust in their government.
Coast to China, harassing the defenders and smashing forts as they went. The Chinese emperor, the Xianfeng emperor of the Qing dynasty, soon after opted to sue for peace. The negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Tianjin, which gave France, Russia, the US and Britain the right to trade and for their citizens to freely travel throughout China.
Emperor Xianfeng was basically forced into trading because of just how much progress the Europeans were making. They even took some very important regions. I think it was in like Zhejiang, very important food regions. So it was really dangerous for the Chinese. So yeah, they were basically forced to sue for peace, and they got to that treaty, but then they didn't really end up wanting to implement the terms.
The US and Russia were allowed to get in on the action despite not fighting, because it meant that if China backed down on their agreements, it would risk retaliation from all four powers. Plus, Russia had just negotiated the transfer of this territory. The Qing didn't want another front to fight on. One problem: when negotiators went to Beijing to ratify this truce in 1859, they were kidnapped and tortured by the Chinese government. This, for the British, was proof that their opinion of the Chinese as being little more than barbarians was justified. The commander of the British forces in China, the Earl of Elgin, was actually against the war, but forward after the capture of the negotiators, he felt that he had to retaliate to protect Britain's honour. The British and French then landed their forces in the north and captured many forts on their way to Beijing. They soon clashed with a large Qing army at the Battle of Palikao. This saw over 1,000 Chinese casualties compared to about 50 on the Anglo-French side. The Chinese had now lost the will to pursue the war.
Okay, he did skip over the Battle of the Dagu Forts, at least the first one, where, as I mentioned, the Europeans just wanted to sail past the forts, completely disregarding them, and they got obliterated. It was one of the worst losses of the war for the Europeans, and then they came back a year later and actually took the fort after some fierce fighting. But that is, I think, a very important event.
Mostly because of, again, the ongoing Taiping rebellion. After the battle, the emperor fled Beijing, leaving his brother Prince Gong to negotiate with the Europeans.
Yeah, and that's a bit complicated because, yes, Prince Gong was kind of left to negotiate, but he wasn't really appointed. He was just literally left there. So when the British arrived, it was like, well, I guess you're going to be the one to negotiate. So yeah, it was a bit of a panicked escape.
Anglo-French forces then moved on Beijing, which opened its gates to them, after which the most famous event of the war happened. The Allied soldiers forced their way into and looted the Emperor's summer palace, and when Elgin found out the Chinese had killed many of the envoys, he ordered it burned to the ground. The Chinese then signed the 1860...
Yeah, I mean, the summer palace, fun fact, they actually originally thought maybe burning down the Forbidden City, and then they decided to go for the summer palace. And the summer palace was massive. It had over 200 palaces and courtyards and gardens. It was absolutely massive. So it was a huge strike to the ego and to the confidence of the Chinese.
60 Treaty of Beijing, which did several things.
Oh, and by the way, I think to this day it hasn't really been restored, and there's a few segments of it that are still basically in ruins exactly the way it was left, kind of as a memorial of what happened when the British came.
It confirmed the 1858 treaty, increased the reparations that China would pay, gave Russia more territory, and also saw Britain gain slightly more land around Hong Kong. Interestingly, this war is called the Second Opium War, but opium's role was largely secondary. This time it was about it.
It's because opium was kind of involved in bringing it, but the wars itself were not really about opium, right? Opium was the catalyst, but there was such a big problem in terms... there was a lot of interest in Europeans to open up China for trade for a very long time. Opium just was the thing that was bringing them revenue, and they just didn't want it to end. So it played an important role, but it's not just about opium. That's important
enforcing open
trade
mind and demonstrating to China that Europeans were now the dominant ones in the region. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, and it's very important because opium would remain legal. So one of the things that the Europeans did is that they basically forced China to legalize opium, and it would remain legal for many years. I think it was only under the communists that opium ended up getting banned. So that's a long time for it to be completely legal. So yeah, and after this, things went south for the Chinese. They had a bit of a sphere of influence around Vietnam that would be lost to the French. They would then lose to Japan. And it's really interesting to see how the Japanese and the Chinese, when put in kind of a similar situation, in the sense that they both got to violently, or not violently necessarily, but forcefully open up. I guess it's different in each case, but both were forced to open up to foreigners. And the Japanese really understood the situation much better than the Chinese, right? So the Chinese went through the Meili Restoration and actually attempted to, become stronger, and eventually, went on a little bit of a rampage and committed a lot of genocide and many very atrocious things. But yeah, the Chinese just really didn't grasp what they needed to do. So it's really, really interesting. So yeah, it's a fun little video by History Matters. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope I got to bring in, a little bit of context, and keep in mind my Opium Wars video is going to come relatively soon. If you enjoy, my content, my yapping, you can also join me here at twitch.tv/TikaNick, where I'm streaming on the regular, just talking about news, some fun things, some not so fun things, given what's on the news recently, I guess. But yeah, I'd love to see you there. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.